Our next speaker, our first after lunch, is Tom. Is it Allbeson?
Allbeson, that's it. Spot on. Thanks.
Okay, and he'll be speaking on Nikon cameras in peace and war, the cultural history of a Seminal camera in the Vietnam era. Thank you, Tom.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Well, I'm really sorry not to be there in person. I know everybody says that when they join via Zoom, but it's nearly 10 o'clock. I'm in Cardiff. It's about mid-30s in terms of Fahrenheit. I'm drinking water. I would much rather be there in California. I imagine it's very sunny. Yeah. And I'd be looking forward to a glass of Chardonnay from Monterey Bay, but I can't join you. Through the magic of technology, I will try and share with you some thoughts on the Nikon F, inspired by some work I've been doing on the history of war photojournalism. So I'm a media historian at the School of Journalism, Media and Culture in Cardiff University, which was established 50 years ago by Tom Hopkinson, who was the editor of the seminal British photo magazine Pitch Post. And I want to talk today about this camera that you can see spinning for infinity on the screen, an SLR, the Nikon F, that came to prominence during the era of Vietnam. So this camera signals the, Michael spoke about this in the previous presentation, signals the Japanese photographic industry overtaking German preeminence in the international market. I won't really be discussing the affordances of this innovative camera, or this camera that brought together lots of different innovations. But I want to look at the ways in which it's been represented in the media and the way in which it's been thought about, imagined, if you like. I feel like a bit of an interloper bringing so much cultural history into this discussion of technology and cameras, but hopefully you'll find it interesting. Because it's a fascinating transnational cultural history. This Japanese camera, used arguably most famously by British photojournalists to document an American war in a former French colony in Southeast Asia. And the images that were produced with this camera had an enduring legacy for the memory of the conflict, but also for the public image of the US, arguably, and for media and military relations for years to come. You know, the impact echoing down through subsequent military operations and conflicts from Panama and Grenada to the Falklands, Malvinas conflict, the Persian Gulf War, and still in Iraq and Afghanistan in this century. So Francois Brunet suggested that war photography is central to the ways in which we think about the medium. And I would agree with that. And I would add as a footnote that the Nikon F is central to the way in which we think about war photography. So I think it's a really important cultural history to try to get our heads around. And odd to throw this image in maybe, but this is the inspiration for the research that I've been undertaking. I'm a big Bob Dylan fan, and I'm interested in the sort of cultural values attached to iconic individuals and their accoutrement, their paraphernalia. And you can see here, of course, the photo of folk musician Woody Guthrie, an early inspiration for Dylan. And the label there on his guitar reads, if you can't see it on the screen, "This machine kills fascists." And I think captured in this photo is an image and an idea of the acoustic guitar. This notion of an instrument, a machine, a tool with sort of inherent political capabilities, capacities, a quasi-magical power to unmask truth and to counter falsehoods. And I think similar mythic qualities attach themselves to the Nikon F, and I'd like to explore how that comes to be. Now, my original plan for this paper was to see how the image and the idea of the Nikon was exploited for commercial gain. At the Tom Hopkinson Centre for Media History at Cardiff University, we've got what I think is quite a rare collection of UK colour supplements, you know, so the magazines that superseded Life and Pitch Post. produced with Sunday newspapers from the 1960s onwards. And a perennial criticism of titles like the Sunday Times and the Sunday Telegraph magazines was that there's this jarring juxtaposition of searing conflict imagery by the likes of Don McCullum and glossy ads for consumer goods. And I'd expected to find examples of the Nikon F being marketed to the British middle classes alongside seminal photo essays on Vietnam by Philip Jones Griffiths and the like. And I spent hours going through many of these boxes, but of course, I didn't find what I was expecting to find. I only found one example of a photograph, an advert featuring the Nikon, and it was for a credit card, not for the camera itself, which indicates the expense of this piece of kit at the time, which was pitched principally at first to the professional market. Now, thankfully, there are a lot more resources in the Tom Hopkinson Centre for me to work with, and hopefully I've got some findings from other material in the collection that will be of interest to you. And I think what emerges is a more complex picture of cameras, of commercialism, and of conflict in the Vietnam era. Looking at the kind of yearbooks that were produced by the British Journal of Photography and US Camera, annuals and collections of photographs aimed at professionals and serious amateurs, which also include adverts. I think it enables us to track the establishment of the cultural salience of the Nikon F, in Britain at least, via the public image of a small number of British war photographers. And I'd suggest that there are around 6 phases to this cultural history of the Nikon F. At first, a kind of burgeoning awareness among Anglophone photographers of the technology being produced in Japan. And then an emergence of the Nikon F itself as a kind of class-leading SLR in the late 50s and into the 60s. A consolidation of photojournalism's kind of countercultural or radical valences, if you like. And then a popularization via photo histories and war movies of the image, or you could even say the celebrity of the camera. And then coming to the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, a musealization of these mythic qualities. And Michael's already spoken a bit about the exhibition of the Nikon in Tate Britain, and I'll touch on that if I don't run out of time. And I'll also touch on the kind of current fan base online of the camera, if, as I say, if time remains. All right, so phase 1 then. Patricia Nelson charts the business history of the Japanese photographic industry, the post-war rise, how it came into public view during the first armed conflict of the Cold War, the Korean War. And you can see here an extract from the New York Times, which reported that the first post-war Japanese camera to attract serious attention in America has created a sensation among magazine and press photographers following the report by life photographers in Korea that a Japanese 35mm camera and its lenses had proved superior to the German cameras they'd been using. So there was a big upset in the international photographic market in the post-war period, partly a result of post-war occupation of both Japan and Germany and the different policies that were conducted there. As I say, Patricia Nelson covers that in more detail. But what I'd like to point out is one example, an advocate for Nikon lenses being used with a Leica camera, David Douglas Duncan, who commented on this in the afterward to his kind of seminal photo book, This Is War, about Korea. Now, Michael, in his book, has already explained the contours of the reputation of the camera that were being established in this period. He's done it much more expertly than I can do here, or indeed anywhere, at any time. As he says, the Nikon F became the archetypal photojournalist camera, and it remains one of the most influential cameras of the 20th century, doing more to build the reputation of the Japanese camera industry than any other model. So I think it's really interesting to reflect on what characteristics the camera had that enabled it to, assume this place in photojournalistic law. The qualities and the characteristics of the camera are summarized here, and I think probably the electric motor winder is one of the key things. It was undoubtedly, you know, an important and an excellent piece of kit. It's very heavy. I didn't quite realize until I went to see one the other day at a second-hand camera shop in Cardiff city centre. It's undoubtedly a key piece of technology, well suited to the rigors of war photojournalism. But I don't want to talk about those affordances because it's not my area of expertise and other people could do it much better. I want to look rather at the representations of the camera in publications aimed at professionals and serious enthusiasts. So I want to consider the cultural work of establishing the reputation of Nikkor lenses and of the Nikon F. And you can see in the center here, a 1961 annual published by Popular Photography, and the advert reads, "The choice of men who know cameras." You got a stern cigarette-wielding professional middle-aged man, rather hideous gender politics, contrasted with the pretty and contented-looking young cover girl on the front. So this is clearly aimed at a discerning, wealthy, white male individual. And the camera there cost around $350 at the time, which I understand is equivalent about $3,500 into today's money. And you get the same approach in the UK as well, with publications targeting professionals and advanced amateurs, the same sort of gendered tropes, available women and white professional men. You can see the caption there to the advert on the left. "Master of all he surveys, the man with a Nikon commands a system of photography whose scope and versatility are virtually unlimited." So then after the launch in the late 50s, another dimension of the idea of the Nikon comes out, and it's facilitated by the war service that the F does. It took a matter of minutes online to find these examples of renowned Vietnam era conflict photographers, all seen holding one, or in some cases, multiple Nikons. And we'll see these renowned photographers are invariably pictured with their cameras in that era, the 60s and the 50s, and later on. In the annuals and the press of the mid-60s, in particular, we start to see the camera associated with some key British photojournalists. And I'm going to run through examples here, probably at a breakneck speed, so apologies for that. But I want to give you the weight of the evidence to show how prominent this camera was in professional and in media discourses. So you can see here, Larry Burrows with his famous photo story for life about the helicopter crew Yankee Papa 13. You can see the same story here with the same portraits, although blown up much larger in the publication from the British Journal of Photography. And when you see that photo close up, you see many of the 5 cameras that Burrows is working with, including one that he's attaching to the helicopter, are Nikons. You can see here the story again in US Camera World Annual of 1966 with the same portrait photography of the same portrait photograph of the photographer working with his tools, and also an advert that was featured in the annual that year. And here's another example for McCullin, a different British photographer, a photo yearbook from 1966, which they often include details of, you know, what camera was used, what film was used, and you can see that here from an extract from the back pages, alongside these portfolios of work and, crucially, adverts pitching the camera to potential purchasers, serious amateurs or, of course, professionals. So those sorts of publications are marketing vehicles, if you like, for the photographer and for the photographic industry. But you see in the press at the time, the photojournalists, again, pictured with their cameras. So bottom right there is McCullen in a now very famous photograph of him with his Nikon F, one of two iterations of that photograph. The photographer and the camera are becoming part of the story here. And this is, what shall I say, embedded further in 1970 when McCullen is shot and his camera stops a bullet from an AK-47 in Cambodia, and there's a kind of veneration of the camera. It not only becomes part of the story but starts to be invested with kind of life-saving capacities, and that moves us to the next era of this cultural history of the Nikon, which is all to do with another cross current. Reaching a crescendo in the late 1960s, anti-Vietnam movements repurposed press photos. You can see here a protest top left from February 1968, women marching on Downing Street, and bottom right, a photograph by David Hearn with a photo within a photo on a placard by John Schneider of a Viet Cong suspect. So the press images are being reused by countercultural voices and instilling a kind of radicalism in the photography through this visual culture. And after that, in the aftermath of 68, you get some very critical photo books, an early version here by Mark Jury, with kind of author photographers being publicized, promoted through these very influential books. The most influential being Philip Jones Griffith's standout Vietnam Inc. Now, I don't need to explain the salience of this book to photo historians, but I do want to suggest it's not exceptional in its sort of format or its content. It might be exceptional in the execution, but Jones Griffith's book is enmeshed in a culture of both protest and marketing in the Vietnam era. And you can see here seductive advertising for the Nikon on the right, and an interview with Jones Griffiths with some pictures from Vietnam Inc. on the left. We have in this era the emergence of the idea of the concerned photographer, of course, given voice by Cornel Capper, and Najib Baer offers a really interesting history of that idea and its sort of Cold War significance. What I want to point to is that idea of the tool of social conscience, and you'll recall Guthrie's guitar. I think we're very much in the same key, this idea of the camera as a tool with particular radical political capabilities. All right, and then we get to adverts from the 60s and 70s, which show an increasing public profile of the camera, and the camera in a starring role you'll see on the left hand side, or the camera that improves your image on the right hand side. By this point, at the end of and after the Vietnam War, the camera has its own celebrity, if you like, its own public profile. And this, as Mike points out in his book, and I think it's Richard Hamilton has explored as well, is really consolidated in the image of Dennis Hopper, himself a photographer, of course, here seen rather ludicrously, you might think, with 4 Nikon F cameras, although, you know, he looks very similar to Tim Page or to Larry Burroughs as they were photographed at the time. So for 2 decades from the late 1970s, this celebrity of the Nikon F becomes embedded. And I put Michael Herr's book there, obviously, because he was involved in writing the script for Apocalypse Now and for Full Metal Jacket. But his book also captures the sort of working lives of photographers like Sean Flynn and Tim Page, helping to embed this image of the photographer and the camera into popular culture. So photo books of that era the late 70s and into the 1980s, started to preserve and to recirculate the visual record of the war, valorizing photography as an eyewitness, as something that offers peculiar insight. And the Nikon F has its role in that. And there's a quotation here from Tim Page talking about how you could pick them up, you know, on military compounds for a bargain compared to the price that they were being sold in the UK. And this continues through the 80s and into the 90s, this kind of recirculation of images and the reinforcing of the image of Vietnam photographers, but also the image, the notoriety, the celebrity of the camera. And in this book from 97 by Page and the AP director, was it, Horst Faas, there are lots of portraits of photographers seen like those images of Burroughs and McCullen with their cameras. And then we emerge into the late 20th and the early 21st century, and it's the era of museums embracing or exploring the history of Vietnam. And this is the penultimate phase that I want to look at. And Michael's mentioned the museum in Bradford, and we can see here a photo circulated some years later of an exhibition at the turn of the century of that camera that reputedly saved McCullen's life. He talks about that in his memoir as well, and you can see that an iteration of that famous photo on the cover, bottom right. There's also the News Museum exhibition of 2015-16. You can see publicity imagery here from that exhibition, all of it kind of investing the Nikon with quasi-sacred status. You know, it's a relic of that era, which has the capacity to connect you with the past, since the photographer held it and they were there. So it's a real sort of a talisman, if you like. I understand that museum has since closed, but there's some interesting footage online about the exhibition. And there have been similar ones at the National Library of Wales. Jones Griffith's archive is now stored there, and a central place, in fact there was a mock-up of his apartment, a central place at that exhibition was reserved for, you know, these sorts of relics, passports, but crucially cameras, with the Nikon F, as in this picture here, taking center stage. And at Tate, more recently, McCullen's camera returns, and not only returns to be exhibited, but then, having been exhibited, circulates widely online, is photographed in its display case and shared. And that brings us to the current phase, the online afterlives of the Nikon F, if you like, the famous camera that photographed Vietnam. And you can see here an example that appealed to me, given that I'm based in Wales, a collector in Wales who believes he has a Nikon F that belonged to the missing photographer and son of Errol, Sean Flynn. And this is just one example of the many lives of the Nikon F online now, in the age of social media and YouTube. You've got amateur sleuthing, you've got very useful and informative technical demonstrations, you've got, you know, elegies to the camera. I hope you like what I did there with the pun, Nikon F for fans. There's some real niche fandom out there. You can buy limited edition portfolios of photographs of the photographer in Apocalypse Now, Dennis Hopper, with Nikons that were owned by the set photographer, Chaz Gerritsen. And of course, there's no cultural trend in the era of the internet that can't be sexualized. And you can see here a stream on Pinterest, girls with Nikon cameras. But that too goes back to those annuals that I pointed out, you know, with the cover girls and the serious white male middle-class professionals. This kind of sexualization and marketing of the Nikon F has run in parallel with the kind of valorization and the heroization of the camera. And now I think, having tracked back over the decades, we can see why, when it comes to films like Blow Up in 1966 and The Omen in 1976, which kind of bookend the Vietnam era, roughly speaking, we can see why those cameras are used for the intimation of truth telling. You know, they have an almost magical premonition ability, especially in the case of The Omen, which I watched again just this week. So there's this paradoxical cultural history, and hopefully I've pointed out some key milestones along the route there. As I said, it was a lot more complicated than I thought it was going to be when I set out to look at the Sunday Times magazines, but I hope it's been of interest. And if you want to know more about current marketing for the Nikon F, no better place to go than the Nikon website, where they have monetized this history very effectively. All right, thanks very much. Sorry for going on a bit.
That was perfect. Thank you.